to the Americans, the British say he found 3 teeth, part of a jawbone and part of a thigh bone. From this, he put together famous Pithecanthropus erectus, dated some 700,000 years old, which was in our textbooks for over 40 years, as the missing link. It wasn't until National Geographic investigated the famous Pithecanthropus that they discovered that the same geological strata in which Dr. Du Bois had found the 2 teeth, or 3 teeth if you're British, a jawbone and a thigh bone, that he had also found 2 complete human skeletons, the same as modern-day Aborigines. He had buried them in a chest for 40 years because they did not fit his philosophical assumption of evolution. It wasn't until National Geographic exposed what he'd actually found that Dr. Du Bois admitted that 2 teeth or 3 teeth were actually that of a modern-day gibbon, a monkey. You go out here to the museum and they have famous Java man and Peking man, Homo erectus they call it. It's very interesting that recent magazine article, let me see if I can find it here. Newsweek magazine, January 11th, 1988, had on the cover "The Search for Adam and Eve on the Origin of Man." And in here they list what they say are the 2 best evidences, Java man and Peking man. You got it out here in your museum. Fascinates me. Do you know who Java man was? Found down in Indonesia? Java man is a skeleton that was put together from bones they collected scattered over a 26-mile area of riverbed. I mean, it's a regular human tinker toy factory down there. I submit to anyone it's highly unscientific, first of all, to put together a skeleton from bones scattered over a 26-mile area of riverbed. Then we had the famous Piltdown man in England. For 40 years it was in our textbooks as the missing link. In 1980, Nature magazine, the leading science journal out of Great Britain, published an article entitled "Piltdown Man Hoax Verified." Here's what we now discover, I quote. An eminent geologist who wanted to deceive a bitter professional rival invented the Piltdown Man fraud, in which a fake prehistoric skull fooled the world for 4 decades. A tape recording by an aged scientist now dead pins the hoax on Professor William Sollas, professor of geology at Oxford University. The victim was Sir Arthur Smith Woodward, keeper of geology at the British Museum, with whom Sollas had feuded. Smith Woodward proclaimed the discovery genuine, as did many distinguished scientists from around the world, and died believing it genuine. Now the article goes on, it ends like this. Why did Sollas never expose the fraud to humiliate his rival? And the article by Dr. Beverly Halstead, professor of geology and zoology at Reading University, she says, quote, I believe he felt unable to reveal the hoax when he saw all the other eminent scientists that joined with Smith Woodward in authenticating the find. What we now discover is that the famous Piltdown man, who was in our textbooks for 40 years as the missing link, that the professor of paleontology at Oxford University in England had a rivalry going with the head of the British Museum of Natural History. So he and some of his students at Oxford had taken a human skull, they attached an orangutan jaw, they chemically dyed it with iron salts to make it look old, they filed down the molar teeth, and they buried it in a hill where he was excavating. The next day, the head of the British Museum goes out, he's digging away, and he discovers this skull. He proclaims it genuine. Scientists from all over the world fly into England, declare it the missing link, and for 40 years it's in our textbooks. The reason we now discover it to be the great fraud is because they did not want to embarrass all the eminent scientists who had declared it genuine. Now that most of them have died, we discover what the truth is. When I speak in university, students will say, well, come on, Carlson, get serious. What about some of the big shots? I mean, what about people like Dr. Louis Leakey? Dr. L.S.B. Leakey excavating Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. What did Dr. Leakey find? Well, if you ever study anthropology, you know Leakey was a great guy. He was quite a character. Died a few years ago. Back in the 1960s, Dr. Leakey discovered what he called Zinjanthropus, earliest man. He really shook up a lot of people because he went and dated Zinjanthropus, what he called earliest man. He dated at 1.2 million years old. Now in the 60s, that shook up a lot of people because up to that time, the supposed earliest monkey man had been dated about 800,000 years. Well, what are you doing finding humans 400,000 years before the earliest monkey man? Well, that wasn't so bad. In 1972, his son Richard Leakey, who's now the curator of the Nairobi Museum, excavating Lake Turkana, Kenya, discovers what he calls Australopithecus africanus, now known as Homo habilis. He goes and dates it 2.2 million years old. Well, that wasn't so bad. His mother, Mary Leakey, wife of Ellis B. Leakey, in 1975, she is excavating in Olduvai Gorge. She discovers what she calls genus Homo, first man. You know what she went and did? She goes and dates it 3.3 million years old. What are you doing with humans 2.5 million years before the earliest monkey man? That wasn't so bad. In 1974 and 75, Dr. Donald Johansen of Case Western Reserve, who is now at the University of California, Berkeley, is excavating in the Afar Valley of Ethiopia. He discovers what he calls Australopithecus afarensis, known as Lucy and the family. Perhaps the most famous find we have today. Lucy is this skull that you've seen in all the science journals and magazines. It has a heavy gorilla ape crest on the forehead. And then he has a partial skeleton called the family, because he says it's actually bones from 13 different individuals that he just lumped into one skeleton to make it fit. It's interesting, he was on the Dick Cavett show a while back. Dick Cavett was looking at this skull of Lucy he had with him. Halfway through the program, Dick Cavett says, "What are these brown spots back here?" And Johansen kind of sinks down in his seat. He says, "Well, those are the chips of bone we found." Dick Cavett said, "What?" He says, "You mean you didn't find this whole skull here?" Johansen says, "Well, no, we found these chips of bone back here." Now, nowhere in any of the science journals or articles does he tell you this. They had a whole write-up in Reader's Digest about it. They make you assume they found this whole skull. Dick Cavett then asked him, he says, "Well, if you only found these chips of bone back here," he says, "what's the rest of the skull?" Johansen, he said, "Well, it's plaster Paris chemically dyed to look like a skull." And if you go out to the museum out here, they'll have a sign that will tell you that most of what you're seeing out there is plaster Paris. Have you noticed that? Dick Cavett then asked him, he says, "Well, if you only found these chips of bone out here," he said, "how do you know it had a gorilla ape crest on the forehead?" Johansen gave the most incredible answer. He said, "Well, obviously evolution occurred. And since evolution obviously occurred, it must have had a gorilla ape crest on the forehead. Don't bother me with the scientific evidence. Let me just hold to my biased presuppositions." Dick Cavett asked him, he said, "Well, how old is it?" He says, "Well, we dated it 4 million years old." He said, "Well, how did you date it 4 million years old?" These were his words, live on television. He said, "Well, when we flew over the Afar Valley in Ethiopia," he said, "when I looked down from the plane," he said, "I could tell that anything we found down there would be 3.5 to 4 million years old." I'm just glad they didn't drop a Dixie cup out the window. Dick Cavett then asked him, he said, "Well, is there any evidence for how Lucy and the family died?" Johansen said, "Well, obviously they had been buried by a massive flood." And Dick Cavett said, "Well, could that have been the flood of Noah?" And I'll never forget Johansen, he went, "Whoa, well, obviously that never happened. Don't bother me with the evidence. Let me just hold to my biased presuppositions." It's very interesting. How do you date things? When you go out to the museum out here and you see these dates that they've dated fossils 1 million years old, 4 million years old, dinosaurs 65 million years ago. You ever wonder how they date those things? I'll never forget when John Chancellor on NBC News announced that they had dated Lucy and the family 4 million years old based upon, and John Chancellor said they dated it based upon carbon-14 dating. Well, I was rolling on the floor laughing. I mean, either John Chancellor didn't have the foggiest idea what he's talking about, or he was blatantly lying to the people. I studied for a year archaeology at the Institute of Holy Land Studies in Jerusalem, and in archaeology we use carbon-14 dating all the time. Even Dr. William Libby, who won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of carbon-14 dating in 1950, even he will tell you you cannot date anything with it beyond 5,000 to 6,000 years, and then there's a high degree of variability. There are a whole set of assumptions that you have to assume before you can use carbon-14 dating. Well, how do they get these assumptions? You see, in paleontology, Paleontology, you have the museum here in Alberta, Canada.